Welcome to World Affairs. I'm Ray Suarez, host of the World Affairs podcast and radio program, which airs on KQED every Monday evening at 8 p.m. I'm also a Washington correspondent for Euronews. We're recording today's conversation for broadcast on the radio. Later on, I'll be asking for your questions. So if you have anything you'd like me to ask, please use the Q&A feature down there on the bottom in Zoom to send me your questions. Our guest today is Séverine Autesserre, a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University, a peace builder, and an award-winning author, drawing from decades of experience working in international aid in war-torn countries, from Afghanistan to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to Kosovo and Colombia and beyond. Professor Autesserre makes the case that building peace does not require billions in aid or massive international interventions, but the most successful peace building follows a bottom-up approach, following the lead of local communities. And her work is not theoretical. She cites countless examples in her latest book, The Frontlines of Peace, An Insider's Guide to Changing the World. Séverine Autesserre, welcome to World Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad your goals were so modest. An insider's guide to changing the world. Nothing bigger than that. A paradox is embedded in there. By definition, the people in a conflict zone have very opposed views of who should be in charge, how a place should be run, who gets the resources. How do you put them in charge of the solution without ending up in pretty much the same situation that demanded an emergency response in the first place?
Well, the first thing is that you take your time. Instead of trying to arrive and think, okay, we have 2 days, we're going to define the problem, define the solution, and implement everything. You actually breathe and you ask people what they think. And that's what I show works in conflict zones. I have stories from Congo to Somalia, etc., etc. And you remember that these stories, they're all long stories that take months or years just to find an agreement, but then the agreements actually work.
Does the situation, though, sometimes force you to do anything but take a breath? After Paul Kagame's forces recapture Rwanda and the Hutu-dominated groups just stampede out of Rwanda across into the DRC, you've got thousands of people living in open fields with no water, no sanitation, no reliable source of food. They're vulnerable to attacks by other groups that are active in the area. This is a potential calamity. And if you said, well, the first thing we should do is think for a while about what to do, that almost seems like the opposite of what an emergency demands.
Right. And I'm going to sound like this professor from New York who think that thinking is the best of all things. Yes, I mean, there are two answers to your question, Ray. The first one is that first, when you ask people on the ground, when I talk to people in Congo, in Afghanistan, etc., they keep telling the same thing to me and to other researchers, which is stop intervening right away and making things worse. They tell us, please think before acting so that you don't make my situation worse. And that I respect. I hate it when people come to me and they pretend that they're going to resolve my own problems and then they make things 10 times worse. So that's the first thing. It's a request from people who live in conflict zones. The other part of the answer is that what you're mentioning is what I call something that calls for a humanitarian aid response. When you talk about refugee camp, about people starving, about people dying, whether we're talking about the emergency in Congo after the Rwandan invasion in the 90s, or the current emergency in Myanmar, or in many other parts of the world, or in Ethiopia, This is what calls for an emergency response, for a humanitarian response, bringing food, bringing blankets, making sure that people don't starve to death, don't freeze to death. That's really important, but that's different from building peace. What you're talking about is addressing the consequences of violence. What I'm talking about is addressing the causes of violence. And to address the causes of violence, again, we need to really make sure that we address the right causes so that we don't make the situation worse.
That's kind of the difference between somebody getting preventive medical care and ending up in an emergency room.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you know in
Mhm.
advance that this thing is going to be a problem, start early, start small, work steadily is definitely the way to go. But we don't seem to
Exactly.
be set up as a world for that, are we?
No, we're not. And that's why I wrote this book, is because whenever I look at the common way to build peace, I see a lot of errors. And again, I've worked on peace building for 20, 25 years now. And for the first part of my career, all I saw were elite agreements, handshakes between presidents, the big conference here in New York or in Addis Ababa. And I focused on that. And I thought, well, this is how we build peace. And I also thought that I would be a diplomat one day and I would interact with presidents and governments. And that way I would build peace. And then I realized that these people don't really have an impact on the ground because peace agreements are signed and then violence continues on the ground. And we've seen that over and over and over again. While when I've started looking at what works in building peace in conflict zones, what works is the kind of bottom-up local initiatives that I describe in the book and that we were talking about.
Was it a gradual realization, or was there one moment or one international assignment? Because you were in this world, you were part of
Yeah.
this world, where you realized, uh-oh, something's wrong with the way we've set up our responses to these crises.
Well, there were many different things. So for instance, when I started as a humanitarian aid worker, I was 22, fresh out of graduate school, and I got my first job as assistant country director for Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World in Kosovo. So I didn't speak Albanian, I didn't speak Serbo-Croatian, I had absolutely no knowledge of Kosovo history, politics, culture. I think I actually started reading my first book about the Balkan on the flight there. And I never finished the book because the flight was coming from Paris, so it was way too short for a book. But the reason I got the job is because I had all of the criteria, all of the skills that are valued in the standard approach to peace building. I spoke English, decent English. My English was not that great at the time. I had fancy master's degrees from universities in France and in the US. I had some experience in other post-war countries. So by the standard of the standard peace building agencies, I was extremely qualified for my job. Well, after that, I realized that no, I knew nothing. I knew nothing, and I wasted a lot of people's time because I was trying to do my best, but I had no idea what I was doing. And sadly, I'm not the only one, and many of my friends who work in international aid have had the same issue, the same situation, and they have realized the same thing.
But there's an interesting example, because you were looking back and talking about your lack of local knowledge, your lack
Mhm,
of cultural context.
mhm.
And sometimes in this part of the world, not Kosovo, but in the peacemaking, peacekeeping assignments, we tend to break the problem down into component parts. So the need for a runway to bring in emergency aid is the same whether you're in East Asia or the Balkans or sub-Saharan Africa. A runway is a runway is a runway. The need to set up emergency water supplies is the same if you're in the Great Lakes region of Africa as it would be if you're on the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. If you talk to the people who do this work, they will tell you similar stories about the places where they've done their work because the problems seem the same to them. Why is local knowledge so important when the challenges of getting people help are not that different in some of these circumstances?
Okay, so if you want to talk about humanitarian aid, I'm going to call my husband who's in the next room and he's going to talk about his work. But if you want to talk about peace building, again, that's the difference. Yes, and yes, water supply can be, not always, can be the same, but even my husband would tell you that even if you're talking about bringing water supply or bringing education, you have to start from the grassroots because it is much more effective. Because it's only the communities who know exactly, okay, why don't they get the water supply? Why have all of the projects before failed? Why is the well, what can a well be? It can be plugged. All of these things require local knowledge, and that's just for what I call humanitarian aid. But now let's move on to peace building. And so if I take your question and I apply it to peace, to the causes of violence, what you're telling me is violence is violence. And, violence that we see in the street of New York, where I am right now, is the same as violence that we see in Congo, which is the same as violence we see in Afghanistan. So of course, yes, there are similarities, both in the causes and in the consequences, but anybody who has been in a war situation, and I'm sure you will agree with me that the causes of violence are not the same, whether you're talking about Afghanistan or Congo. And even more importantly, when you're talking about one country and you go down to the level of the village, the reason why people are fighting in one village is going to be different from the reason why people are fighting in another village. In the place that I know best, in Eastern Congo, very often people tell me the reason I'm fighting is because I'm protecting my community. I'm protecting my family. I'm protecting my children against the militia, against the other. When I go and I talk to the other, they tell me, well, I'm protecting my community against the guy you were talking with. So protecting your community, or it can be, I need land. I need this piece of land because I need to cultivate food. I need the food to survive, to feed my family. I need to have something I can sell to the market so that I can send my children to school. So I'm fighting to keep that piece of land against this other person who wants to take it. And that other person will tell me, well, I want to take it because it's my right. I have a claim on that. So every time you try to talk to people in conflict zones, you realize that the reasons why they are fighting are incredibly different. And therefore, you cannot have this standard approach that's designed in New York or in Geneva or in Washington, D.C. and think, okay, this is how I'm going to resolve everybody's problem in the entire country. It's just not going to work. And it doesn't work.
Well, recently we saw terrible scenes of stampeding civilians, carrying everything they could take from their homes in the Central African Republic. Is that really that different from what we saw during the dissolution of Yugoslavia? When, what did you see? You saw civilians clogging the roads with everything they could carry out of their houses. Is it that important to have the help of local people when, to save lives in the immediate moment, you got those guys with guns over there, you got those guys with guns over there, and job one is to make sure they stay apart from each other and stop killing civilians? I'm not denigrating the importance of local knowledge, but it also seems to me that there is some commonalities that exist between a lot of these different crises.
But of course, Ray, and that's why I think half of the book is talking about why we need outsiders, what I call outsiders, so people who come from the outside, from outside of the conflict zones, the peacekeepers, the diplomats. We need them, but we need them to work better. We need them to work smarter. And that's what the book is about, is saying, okay, we need them. Currently, very often they do more harm than good. So we need to keep what's working and to get rid of the problems and replace them with the strategies and with the solutions that we've seen working in places like the former Yugoslavia, like the Central African Republic, like Congo, like Israel and the Palestinian territories, and all of the other places I talk about in my book. So that's really important, Ray. I'm not saying, when I say local knowledge is important, it doesn't mean that it's the only thing that matters. It's not. It's just that usually we forget about local knowledge. We think that as outsiders, as people who are highly educated, who have a lot of power, symbolic power and cultural power, we think that we can go in and resolve problems for people, whether we're talking about inner city communities in the United States or whether we're talking about populations in war zones. And I'm saying that this is fundamentally wrong. We shouldn't have this attitude. When we go in, we should be much more humble, and we should take the back seat so that we enable local people to be in the driver's seat, because that's what works.
Well, we're going to talk about what doesn't work and what does work. One thing that you come back to again and again in the book is what you call Peace Incorporated, Peace Inc. What did you observe? What is it?
So Peace Inc. is the traditional approach to building peace. It's an approach that's based on a lot of misleading assumptions. For example, the idea that only outsiders have the skills and the expertise to build peace. And that's how I ended up in Kosovo, although I knew nothing about Kosovo. It's also this idea that only top-down intervention, so working with elites, with presidents, with governments, with rebel leaders, this is the only way to end violence. And also the idea that all good things come together. So we can promote peace and democracy and justice and human rights as a package deal, and everything is going to work. And so, yes, I show in the book that in an ideal world, it would be wonderful, but unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. And therefore, this Peace Inc. strategy is really, really wrong. It doesn't help end violence, and often it actually makes the situation worse.
Can you give us some examples of places where you saw solvable problems that weren't getting solved because Peace Inc. had landed and they were doing what they normally do?
Okay, I'll tell you a very, very simple story. So it was a very long time ago, 2004 in Congo. Rebels took over the city of Bukavu, where I was staying. And so for several days, we had bomb flyings. We had the rebel soldiers who took over the city, and they started raping a lot of people, killing a lot of people, looting a lot of houses. It was really a terrible, terrible time. And at a point, there was a little boy and his mother, and they saw several soldiers enter the house just next to theirs. And they heard their neighbor shout and scream. It was obvious that their neighbor was about to be raped. So the little boy ran for help, and he ran for help. He ran to one of the peacekeeping bases that was just next to their home. And when he arrived, Peace Inc. was there. Peace Inc. was represented by a sentry on duty who was a Uruguayan soldier who didn't speak Swahili and didn't speak French, so didn't speak any of the local languages spoken in Congo. So, okay, the boy uses body language. The role of the peacekeeping mission at the time was to protect the local population. It was a time of crisis. It was a time of war, of rape. So the little boy tried to communicate what was happening using body language. And then at a point, the sentry made a sign that, yes, okay, I got it. Just wait a few minutes. He went inside the base, and he came back a few minutes later with a pack of cookies. that he gave to the boy? Cookies. So not only the guy didn't speak Swahili or French, but also he had so little understanding of the situation that he didn't realize that when someone was asking for something in the middle of looting, raping, and bombing, it was for protection. It was not for cookies. And to me, that really exemplifies a lot of the problems with Peace Inc. I have a lot of other stories like that in the book. So,
well, how could that particular example, how should that have been otherwise?
Well, you can send people who with a better training. I mean, first you can send people who speak at least some of the local languages. If they don't speak the local languages, they should have the time to learn the local languages before going there. The Peace Corps, for instance, has a 6-month training program in which people learn local languages before going into their next posting. So learning local languages, having actual briefing about what the situation is like, what are the problems, what people want, because usually when peacekeepers are trained, they get a 2 weeks training, and a lot of it is based on bureaucratic stuff. How do you fill out the report? How do you request R&R, rest and relaxation? How you get your a house that a place to stay that will be approved by the security services. All of the stuff that are very logistic, but that don't help you do your job better. They're just bureaucratic things. And my friends who work for the United Nations and for NGOs, for non-governmental organizations, they often tell me that when they arrive, they know extremely, extremely little about the situations that they want to change and that they're here to help. And they have to learn on the job. And learning on the job, well, it means that very often they're going to make mistakes.
You can understand why this happens, though.
Of course. I was part of that system.
There's a sort of momentum that has built up in this world, because we've seen what happens when the international response is slow. Rwanda is a good example. The world waited 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, more than 800,000 people were killed. We saw in the Balkans as some countries stood to the side and there were massacres because the response wasn't swift. Not necessarily the most learned response, not necessarily the most prepared response, but the idea now is we can't just sit around and wait. We've got to jump in there right away. And that probably contributes to the situation you're talking about.
It does, and we could spend 1 hour, 2 hours. We could spend the entire day talking about these problems. But the important point to keep in mind is that there is another way to build peace. There is another way to build peace that actually works, that doesn't make the situation worse, and that promotes an actual end to the fighting and an actual end to the violence on the ground.
What does that look like?
It looks like what I describe in the book. So it looks like first a very low profile from outsiders, from people like you and I, a very backseat approach to peace building. It looks like people who don't arrive and think that they know better. They know the problems and they're going to implement the solutions right away, but rather people who listen to local populations and who are open-minded, who understand that other people have a different understanding of peace and democracy and development. So for instance, there is one organization that I really like that's called the Life and Peace Institute. And that's exactly how they work. When they recruit people to send to conflict zones, they try to find people who already have a knowledge of that conflict zones. When these people arrive on the ground, they're in it for the long run. They stay on site for years, sometimes close to a decade. And they don't try to hang out in the expat circles, in the circles of international aid workers that you and I know so well, but they try to hang out with local populations. They try to develop local networks and to have friends among the communities that they're working with. And it's an approach that takes time. So it's an approach where, for instance, when they want to resolve a problem, they're going to invite everybody to tell them, okay, what is the problem? Why are you fighting? And then they will realize sometimes that the problem that they thought they were addressing was actually not the real issues and the real reasons for the fighting.
I'm wondering if, for all the wisdom encapsulated in what you've just been talking about, whether in some places the problems are so unavoidable and so huge that even this patient longitudinal response isn't going to be enough. When you think about the Janjaweeds in Sudan raiding farmers in the Darfur region, some of that was driven by climate change. The places where they would water and pasture their livestock, the livestock being their entire repository of wealth, were drying up. They had to go other places, but the world has become a much tighter place. When you go somewhere else in search of resources, there's usually somebody already there. Will there be, in the world we're looking at for the next couple of decades, more resource-based conflict that's going to be hard to solve, in part because we can't create new world for ourselves? There's not any more land being created anywhere.
Well, resource-based conflict have been there for decades, for centuries. It's not something new. And yes, climate change is making things worse in certain parts of the world and different, but it doesn't mean that the solutions that we have found to resolve violence are not going to work anymore. So let's take Somalia and Somaliland. Somalia and Somaliland are really affected by climate change and by all of the problems that we were describing, because it's, again, a population where livestock is extremely important. It's your source of wealth. It's also your source of status. It's your source of power. So livestock is extremely important, and livestock has been decimated in over and over again in the past few decades. But the interesting thing is when you compare, so if you see a map of Africa, you have Somaliland, that's an autonomous region in the north of Somalia. And you know that Somalia is extremely violent. It has some of the highest ranking in the world's least desirable category, most corrupt countries, second most failed state, extremely violent. Every day I read news about a new bombing, a new terror attack, a new massacre in Somalia. So that's Somalia. And then in the north, you have this autonomous region called Somaliland. And Somaliland went through a very bloody independence war with Somalia in the late 1980s and in the 1990s. But Somaliland, for the past 20 years, has experienced very little violence, very, very little terrorism. It has a well-functioning state. It has decent public services. It even has some kind of functioning democracy. And what's absolutely fascinating about Somaliland is that when you look at why it works, so of course there are many reasons for the difference, but you see that the usual Peace Inc. approach prevailed in Somalia, while in Somaliland, Peace Inc. didn't run the show. In Somaliland, the peace was built from the bottom up. It was built by the communities, by ordinary people, by teachers, by local businessmen, by farmers, by herders, by all of the populations together. And they found ways to build peace, not only on a very small scale, not only in their little village, but also if you look at Somaliland, it's actually quite a large territory. I think it's bigger than Syria. So to me, it's a fascinating place of the world, because we can learn so much from them in terms of what works to build peace during and after mass violence.
And let me just point out for our listeners that Somalia is the internationally recognized country and internationally recognized government, and very, very few places in the world recognize the existence of an entity called Somaliland, even though, as the professor points out, that's the place that's running properly with decent water and sanitation and protection for the daily life of its citizens. But it is if you look at a map of the world, it's a totally imaginary state. It doesn't really exist in the way that we think of states existing. If they turned up at the UN and said, here we are, the delegation from Somaliland, nobody would seat them and nobody would recognize their credentials.
Oh, but they try. They try regularly because they want their sovereignty. They believe that they're a country and that they deserve independence and that they deserve to be treated like a state. And I think that there are 2 or 3 countries in the world that actually recognize them as a sovereign country. But you're right that in international law, Somalia holds sovereignty over the entire territory, including over Somaliland, although in practice, Somaliland it completely escaped the rules of Somalia. And to me, that's what's really interesting, because that links back to what we were talking about. The fact that diplomats, when they want to interact with, when they want to build peace in Somalia, they're going to interact with the warlords who are based in Mogadishu, in the capital of Somalia. And they're not going to interact with the people who actually run the show on the ground in Somaliland and who have the power and who have the knowledge to build peace.
But if you were part of a delegation headed to the Horn of Africa and you told your superiors, I'm going to Somaliland, they would probably tell you no, because countries work in the context of countries. They don't work in the context of these other entities. So if you said, look, this is the place that's really working, I want to go there and talk to those people, you might even be forbidden from going. Given the way these things are funded and the way they're set up, you'd be forbidden from going.
You would be forbidden from going. And if you insisted and if you went, you would be fired. And I have quite a few colleagues and friends who have tried to implement the kind of approach that I'm describing that works better, the approach that is not based on states, on governments, on rebel leaders, and they got fired or they got kindly pushed away, because that's an approach that goes against a lot of the things that we consider to be the proper way of building peace, which is interacting with government and states, etc., etc.
Is it too cynical to wonder if Peace Inc. is never really meant to end the need for itself? If it's an industry, maybe its interests are in keeping itself going and not putting itself out of business. You know, there are UN agencies that are set up in part to supply the needs and speak to the interests of Palestinian refugee camps that were set up after the 1948 war.
I've heard this question quite a few times, and to me, it sounds too much like a conspiracy theory. And I don't think this is accurate, because when you talk to people who work for these agencies at UNRWA, the agency set up to help Palestinian refugees, or who work for any other parts of the United Nations system, or even for many diplomats who work in conflict zones, people come in with the best of intentions very often. So yes, They have their own interests, they want their comfortable lives, etc. But they also really believe that they will help local populations on the ground, and that they are doing something good. And some of them make enormous sacrifices. I'm sure you know a lot of aid workers who have sacrificed their family life. They don't see their wives and children and husbands and loved ones and parents for years. They miss their children growing up. They miss everything about their country, and they go to places so that they can help perfect strangers because they think that they're doing the right thing and they think they can help. And to me, that's why it's so important that we get our peace building strategies better, because when we have people who are smart, who are devoted, who are dedicated, who really want to do the right thing, we need to give them the tools to do the right thing instead of preventing them from doing their job. And that's why, again, I think we really need to change the way we go about building peace.
How is conflict different from post-conflict responses to a crisis in the world? When war, civil conflict, militia fighting is ongoing, that's one thing. Separating combatants, keeping them apart, maintaining order after that is a tough business. But when it's done right, what should it look like?
So your first question was, how is conflict different from post-conflict? The answer is very simple. It's not. Before, the United Nations would tell you, oh, there is such a thing as, a conflict and then a post-conflict and then something else. And now everybody understands that violence actually circles. So you always have ups and downs, and you cannot really think in terms of conflict and post-conflict. And this idea of thinking once you have a peace agreement, now you're in a post-conflict phase, most people understand that it's actually unhelpful because violence continues after the peace agreement. So the way peace actually looks like when it's done properly is by first involving everybody in the definition of the problem. So you remember this organization I was telling you about, Life and Peace Institute. When they want to resolve a conflict, they invite everybody that matters. So they talk to politicians, but also to farmers, to women's groups, to ordinary people, to militia commanders, soldiers, rebel leaders, everybody who may have a stake in the conflict. And then they spend time just trying to make sure that everybody agrees on a definition of the problem. And there is one story that I really like was when they were intervening in the Ruzizi plain in eastern Congo. It's a plain where you have cycles of violence. You've had cycles of violence for 20 years. And at the time, before LPI started working there, we all thought that the cycles of violence was because the neighboring country, Rwanda, was intervening, and it was basically a proxy war between Rwanda and Congo. And LPI started talking with people and working with local Congolese organizations. And after 3 years of discussion, etc., they realized that the problem was not at all a proxy war between Congo and Rwanda, but it was actually a conflict between herders and farmers. Because cattle often destroyed crops, the farmers retaliated by killing the herders. The herders' families reached out to local militias who went on to attack the farmers' communities, and so on and so forth. And it escalated every time you had the seasonal migration of cattle. And so once you have the proper definition of the problem, you realize that the solutions are going to be very different. Because if you think the problem is a war between Congo and Rwanda, you're going to talk with the Congolese and Rwandan government, and then you're going to try to have peace agreements, which is what we had all been doing for years. And when LPI realized that it was actually a herder-farmer conflict, they put in place completely different solutions. So, for instance, they established paths to move cattle with very little disruption to farmers. They put public signposts. I have a photo of this public signpost to really clearly mark the path that the herders should take with their cattle. They established mediation committees so that herders and herders and farmers could discuss about any problems that may arrive. And the thing is that before all of the big conferences, abstract peace agreement that had never really made a difference on the ground, well, local people saw tangible results once LPI and its partners got involved. So for several years, the seasonal migration of cattle triggered very little violence. You also had dozens of militiamen who went in and handed in their weapons and went back to their communities. And even ethnic groups, you were talking about people who are fighting and, who are really, really fighting over resources. Well, these people who were fighting over scarce resources, they started living and working together again. So for instance, they started sharing the same market, which is a really, really big deal.
Would multinational organizations, NGOs, international agencies, Peace Inc., really have to re-engineer themselves, bring on board different skill sets, really change how they do what they do to take on your model, the one that you just described in a conflict zone?
They would. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm not super popular at the United Nations headquarters or within some foreign affairs ministry. It's because they would have to change their routines. They would have to hire new people. So yes, we still need to have experts in gender, election organization, human rights, military experts, etc. But also we need to have experts in local conflict. We need to have people who understand about local conflict resolution, and we need to have country experts and people who know a lot about the country where they're going to be working, or even better, about the province, about the village. And the way of going about their job is also going to be different. It's not going to be based in capital cities and headquarters too much anymore. It's going to be a lot of going to rural areas and spending time with people and listening to ordinary people, rather than thinking that you know better and that you have the solution and that you're bringing the solutions to people's problem. Like it's a complete change of mentality. You don't know better, but the people who are experiencing the conflict can tell you what they need. And then you need to think about how you can provide what they need. It's very different, and it's not easy for them to change, but it's possible because, again, I've seen a lot of success stories and I've seen people do that. So we know it's possible.
Let me remind all our listeners that we're taking your questions. Go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type your question in there for Séverine Autesserre. One of our attendees asks, how can this model apply to a place like Syria?
So the first answer would be ask people in Syria. Don't ask me, a person based in New York, but ask people. And it's not a cop out. I'm not trying to evade the question. I really believe that the way to the model, it's more a set of guiding principles. And the set of guiding principles is saying, well, we need to ask people on the ground why they are fighting and what it would take for them to feel safer and to stop fighting. And so the way to apply this principle in Syria would be, instead of thinking, okay, I know that the conflict is between the government and this rebel group, and I'm going to organize a big conference and we're going to have a peace agreement, etc., etc. Going there and asking Syrian people, okay, what do you think is going to make a difference in your life? And then following their leads.
Can you give us an example of a place where making peace or restoring order or restoring livability worked and was sustained over time, using the response that you just gave with Syria as to what works?
Okay, so I've already told you about Somaliland, which to me is a perfect example of restoring peace, but I'm going to tell you about my other favorite place from the book. That's the island of Ichwi. So Ichwi is fascinating because it's located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Congo is the stage of one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II. You know that millions of people have died, making it maybe the deadliest conflict since World War II. Babies have been raped, grandmothers have been raped, 2 million people have been displaced. It's a really, really hard situation, humanitarian situation. And then if you look in the middle of the Kivu provinces, in the epicenter of the conflict, you have this little island on Lake Kivu that is called Ichwi, and that is a heaven of peace. Ichwi has been peaceful for the past 20 years in the middle of one of the deadliest conflicts that we have around us. And it has been peaceful thanks to the everyday involvement of all of its citizens, including the poorest and least powerful ones. So when I'm in Ichwi and when I ask people, okay, how do you do that? Very often they tell me, oh, it's because we have a culture of peace. Oh, that's really interesting. So what is a culture of peace? Well, it's something that my father taught me. Okay, good. Good. Your parents taught you a culture of peace, but you know, what is in that? And people tell me, well, it's just that we're peaceful. We resolve conflict peacefully. So when there is a problem, we're not going to use violence, but we're going to reach out to local mediators. So either it's going to be the village elder or it's going to be the priest. Congo is a very, very religious country. So the priest has a lot of influence. Or it's going to be sometimes the local imam, or it's going to be the local teacher or someone who is an important businessman. So they have a lot of mediators, and sometimes people actually get involved by themselves. So my friend and research assistant, Kair, at a point he saw that younger children were getting a bit rowdy and they started fighting among themselves, and the teenagers were talking about raping girls. So what he did, he took several of his friends and they organized a soccer club for the kids so that the kids would have something else to do after school. And so that Kair, who was maybe 5 years older, would provide them with nonviolent role model, would show them, okay, this is what you can do with your spare time in a way that is appropriate for each week. So people really take the peace into their hands and they promote the peace on a daily basis, and they maintain the peace, and they've maintained this for 20 years.
You're welcome to enter more questions for Séverine Autesserre at the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. One of our attendees asks, is Séverine familiar with the work of Nonviolent Peace Force, or Peace Brigades International, and the growing field of unarmed civilian protection? Are they mentioned in her book? Any thoughts on these international organizations?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for asking. So I've been talking a lot about Africa, but I also talk about Colombia, about 12 different conflict zones in the book. And one of them is Colombia. And in Colombia, I talk about this zone of peace, this peace community called San Jose de Apartado. And in San Jose de Apartado, it's again in the middle of one of the most violent provinces in Colombia, but it's a community where people have managed to band together to reject violence and to reject the armed groups that control the neighboring countryside. And as we were talking about, in the peace strategy that works, you have a role for insiders, so for people from the peace community, but you also have a role for outsiders. And the outsiders, in the case of San Jose de Apartado, the outsiders are Peace Brigade International. They are these nonviolent interveners who actually help by staying with the people of the peace community, especially with the people who are threatened by the armed group, because the armed groups are going to think twice before killing a member of the community that is surrounded by outside interveners, by people coming from the United States, from France, etc. Because armed groups very often don't want to hurt their reputation by killing unarmed civilians in front of foreigners. So the work that these Peace Brigade Internationals do are really important, I think. And when I was in San Jose de Apartado and I asked, that was when I asked, what can outsiders do to help you? The work of Peace Brigade International was mentioned, and the fact that these people stay on site and help physically protect the members of the community was very important, just like the advocacy that they're doing in the capital Bogota and in other parts of the world. So yes, I am familiar with these organizations, and I really admire the work that they do.
Another questioner: how has worldwide disinformation that we're currently seeing, QAnon and extreme violence groups spreading disinformation, affecting peace building?
Well, disinformation, unfortunately, is not something new in peace building, because when you're on the ground in places like Congo or Afghanistan, to me, these are places where rumors run the show. Very, very often you hear about, oh, there is a rumor that so-and-so is going to attack the town. Rumors are there all the time, and most of these rumors are wrong. And most of these rumors are what we call disinformation here in the United States. So one of the things that's really important in peace building is trying to figure out what is accurate and what is not accurate. And that's why, again, I go back to this idea that we need to involve everybody in the definition of the problem, because once people start talking with each other, they realize that what they thought was just hearsay. It's not proper information. It's not accurate. No, the other person doesn't want to kill them. No, the other person is not going to kill them as soon as they see them. The other person is a human being just like them. And that's why it's so important to let people confront their version of the story and their version of the problems, so that they finally manage to have accurate information, and from there they can define the problem and define the solution.
It seems to me that one thing that communities experiencing that have in common is that they're often located in places where the government is either non-existent, not trusted, or considered to be very far away, so that it doesn't really intrude in their lives. It is not a source of authority. And there's also no media that's trusted as a consensus source of information. So rumor becomes fact in a world where there's nobody you can trust. And your networks, your near-in networks, pass along information that can be totally wrong, but you're willing to accept it from your neighbor when the provincial governor 200 miles away is somebody that you think of as a thief or an enemy. So you're not going to trust him as a source of information.
Yes, completely. And that's why, again, a lot of the important work that the United Nations or some non-governmental organizations are doing are actually to try to clamp down on rumors and to provide accurate information, so as to decrease the tensions.
Another attendee asks, what about the Tigray War in Ethiopia? Can you explain how things fell apart there? It had been regarded as an international success story. And how can your approach to peace building help in a country like that?
So I cannot tell you about the Tigray War because I haven't been there. I was in Ethiopia maybe 5 years ago for the last time. So I I would not be the right person to explain. And again, I'm going to tell you the same thing that I told the person who asked the question about Syria. We need to ask people who are integrated. We need to ask people who are part of the conflict to tell us what they think is going on. We shouldn't ask someone like me who's based in New York. And as to how my approach can help, there are organizations, for example, the Hunger Project, that work with local communities on the ground in Ethiopia, and that are really trying to implement this kind of bottom-up approach to peace and development. And from what I know, they're doing a fantastic job. I'm not saying that just because my husband works for them, but also because I truly believe that they do a fantastic job. And also something really important, you know that with the COVID pandemic, a lot of the international organizations have had problem with their way of working because they can't send expatriates and foreigners to the places where they used to send them. They can travel internationally, etc. But the grassroots organizations in Ethiopia, in other parts of the world that already work with community members, they haven't had the same kind of problems. They've had problems, but they've managed to continue working the way they used to do because they're already based in the community. And so their work has adapted much better to the COVID pandemic, and they've managed to continue to provide security and development and aid to a lot of the communities that they were working with.
How has your book been received by people who run Peace Inc., UN, and multinational NGOs?
The book is just out. It was officially released, I think, 10 days ago. So far, I don't know. I don't even know if they've heard of it or if yeah, I think they have.
But this isn't the first time you've said things like this, though. I mean, I'm sure
No.
there are people who are aware of your skepticism about the way we've been doing things so far.
Oh, okay. So for that, so there are usually three different kinds of reactions by the leaders of Peace Inc. The first one is a lot of people get really angry at me and really upset and very defensive and say that they're doing wonderful things and how dare I criticize their work, while to me, I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to help them be better. But I understand. I understand people being angry, and that's completely fine. The other interesting thing is, oh, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. You're describing the other one so well. So the peacekeepers
Not
tell
the
me,
place I work.
Right. Not mine. No, you describe it. So the peacekeeper tell me you describe the diplomats so well. The diplomats tell me you describe the United Nations so well, or you describe the NGO. I mean, everybody think that I describe the other one very, very, very well, and the other one really has to change and to do what I tell them to do.
Well, I've known many of these people. You've mentioned that you're married to one. They're compassionate, they're brave, they're resourceful, they're knowledgeable, they're tremendously useful. Is the problem that we're just using them incorrectly?
I think that the problem is that when we're sending them to conflict zones, we give them the wrong strategy, the wrong approach, and the wrong way of going about the situation. And I know because we train at Columbia, at SIPA, we train a lot of these people. And very often when they arrive in my class and they start talking about bottom-up peace building, they're like, oh, I never thought about that, but I like it. So they're not exposed to this kind of thinking. So we train them in a way, let's go and build peace from the top down. And you, after a master's degree, you're going to have the answer, you're going to have the solution, you're going to be the big shot. And I think we do them a disservice because when they arrive on the ground, they realize that their work is not what they thought it would be, and that their effectiveness is not what they wished it would be. And very often then they try to change the situation from the inside, but it's really hard for them to do that. And so I think that the number of people who are trying to change the situation from the inside, to rely on insiders, to use the strategies that work, this number of people is growing, and it's growing. And eventually, I really hope that they're going to manage to change the situation, and we're going to have the better peace building strategies, that the ones that I've seen at work in conflict zone, and that really, really manage to decrease violence.
Very quickly before we go, is it important to have multiple models of success to point to and say, look, this is the other way of doing it. This is where it's worked?
Yes, and that's why I've been in conflict zones all over the world. I've tried to hit the different continents. I've tried to have rich countries, poor countries, different religions, different stage of development, because I want to show that this is possible everywhere, and it's even possible at home in our own communities, because that way we can all learn something and not apply it directly, not use a template, but use these ideas so that we can help improve things around us. And it really, really makes a difference.
Séverine Autesserre's new book is The Frontlines of Peace, an insider's guide to changing the world. Thanks a lot, Séverine, for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ray, for having me. And thank you for listening.
Thanks to you, for all our listeners, for joining us and participating. Please join World Affairs tomorrow, March 11th at noon Pacific, for No Bread, No Peace, a live program with Etherine Cousin, former executive director for the World Food Program. We'll talk with Linda Calhoun about food security as foreign policy. I hope you'll join us then. Thanks again for being with us today. Have a great rest of your week.